All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Hopefully you all can hear me. We're sending out audio information to call in via a landline, so monitoring the chat there. So the presentation today is brought to you by the Society of California Archivists Education Committee. My name is Adrian Turner, and my co-host is Maurice Silva. And this is the first of what we anticipate in an ongoing series of web-based workshops, webinars, training sessions that are going to be offered through SCA. So from a recent survey of the SCA membership, many of you expressed a strong interest in online-based training sessions and web-based sessions. So we're really working on ramping up these offerings. The other piece of information is that this is a new web hosting platform, a relatively new web hosting platform that we're using, and this is really kind of the inaugural webinar using that. So thanks for your patience with this, and hopefully we have all the bugs worked out for today. So yeah, thanks for bearing with us. I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters for today's webinar. So we have Kelly Spring, who's the Archivist for Special Collections at the University of California, Irvine, where she coordinates the accessioning and processing of manuscript collections, and she also serves as the metadata lead and liaison between UCI Special Collections and Technical Services. And we also have Laura Jackson, who was the University Archivist at UC Irvine from 2014 through August 2017. So she recently took a position at the University of Northern Colorado, and she's now serving as the Special Collections and Archives Librarian there. So before turning it over to Kelly and Laura, we just want to note a few housekeeping points. As we've been saying during the presentation, all of your lines are muted. So please use the chat option to let us know if you're having connection or audio issues. And if you have questions along the way for the presenters, please send them as a chat to all participants. So Marie's going to be monitoring and collecting those for periodic Q&A breaks over the course of the presentation today. We're also recording today's session. We're going to circulate a link to the recording after the meeting today. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Kelly.
All right, thank you so much, Adrian. So we are really excited to do this first webinar. We're so happy you all are here, and there are so many of you. I just hope we do a really good job and give you some useful information today. So let's get started. First, what we will cover. So we will cover project planning specific to managing archival collections. We'll include ways you can track your holdings, track incoming materials, and track your progress. We'll cover some helpful principles as gleaned mostly from the document called the Guidelines for Efficient Archival Processing in the University of California Libraries. We'll give you some useful tips that we've come across or learned from others in the course of our work. And then finally, we'll give you some real examples that illustrate the reality of the choices that we have to make when we're working with our collections. What we won't cover, though, is archival theory, appraisal and evaluation, detailed information on how to process, and born digital records. So efficient processing. Well, what exactly do we mean by efficient processing? So let's think about this in terms of our collections. So how often do we get a collection that comes in usable folders, nice and neat, in the exact order that the creator had them? Yeah. Normally they come in more like this. And we do the best that we can. And it's great that we love our job almost as much as we love chocolate, because invariably there is somebody standing behind us from administration yelling, "Speed it up!" So what do? Well, we take the chocolates out of our hats and we take a deep breath and we reconnect with our purpose as archivists. And that is to make collections available. So what does it mean for it to be available? Well, first, information about the collection should be published. At the University of California, Irvine, we create collection level records for everything that comes in. And we do this at the point of accession. We create a resource record if it's a new accession. If it's an accession to an existing collection, then we augment the existing resource record. And then we post all of this to the Online Archive of California. Another way of assuring that the collections are available is to make sure that the physical material is logged in some way. So here again at UCI, we have a stacks locator database, and we make sure that we have physical control over the material so that we can find it and get it into the hands of users when they request it. So collection level records, what does that mean? Well, first, you'll want to identify your baseline standards. So at UCI, we use the Describing Archives Content Standard published by the SAA, and we create what we call single level minimum description records or finding aids. And so let's take a look at what one of those looks like. So here's the Cynthia Bashal scrapbooks. And you can see that our baseline standards are that we include the language of the material, the name of the contributing institution, the title of the collection, the creator, the call number, very important, an extent so that folks know how much there is, the inclusive date, and up here, not shown on screen, but you could click on it, are the conditions governing access. And finally, because we post to the Online Archive of California, we include a couple of other things such as abstract and a filing title and such. So because you'll want to have your baseline standards, and this is going to vary depending on your institution, but overall this is going to give you confidence in knowing what you need to do to get these collection level records made and get them available online. So now guidelines. So this, we use the Guidelines for Efficient Archival Processing in the University of California Libraries. It's a long title, it's a long document, but in the long run, it's really good for you. I consider it the sweet spot. So it's the least amount of work that you need to do in order to make a collection usable. So high quality processing is not necessarily measured by how intense or how detailed we make it. The UC guidelines are created to expedite getting these collection materials into the hands of our users. And they assure that the arrangement of materials is adequate enough to meet users' needs. And we take the minimal steps necessary to physically preserve the collection materials. And then we also make sure that we describe them sufficiently so that they can be promoted and can be used. So now we have our baseline standards, we have our guidelines, and now let's put this into action. So how are we going to get these into the hands of users? Let's back up a minute and think about project management. So you're going to want to set up a workflow. You're going to want to put together an inventory, a checklist to help you get through, and then an overarching project plan. An inventory in this case is to look around your repository. You might have legacy items. You might have material on the shelves. You might have things hiding in the closets, and you may go into the stacks and find stuff tucked back there that you forgot you had. So write all of this down. It can be simple. When you're doing your inventory and when you're doing your project planning, make sure you're taking into account scalability. So you can take a clipboard and a pencil and go back into the stacks and write down all of these things that have not been accounted for yet. They haven't been accessioned, and you don't necessarily have physical control over them. But you can also make it in a Word document. So here's an example of a Word document that was left for me by my predecessor. And thankfully, it says here, well, we have some dance ephemera and promotional materials that came in that need to be accessioned. They came in 2014. I started in 2015, but that's normal. Down here, we have some material that came in 2003. Again, these are legacy items. So write them down. Just get them in your inventory so you know what you're dealing with. Another way you can do your inventory is title it Weird Things on Shelves. This is another inventory that was left for me, and I'm very grateful for this because they are interesting things that were left on the shelves, such as miscellaneous manuscript, ephemera, and other printed materials. We don't know if they need to be integrated into existing collections or just accessioned brand new. A lot of the material apparently seems to be very old purchases, and it would make a great intern project. You can also use a spreadsheet to create your inventory. So here's an example that I created at a previous job, and I looked around my office and just wrote down everything that needed to be accounted for. And so here you can see these are the items that were not yet accessioned. And I knew I needed to deal with those. And I put over here what they were: unknown photograph, Baltimore bibliophiles items, some gift letters from a vendor. At least I have an idea. There are these things on the shelves around my office. This is what they are. I need to do something with them. And finally, if your institution has a wiki, or if you want to put one together, you can take your inventory and put it there. The benefit of that is that it's centrally accessible to anyone else who is in your institution. And so do you remember that document called Weird Things on Shelves? Yeah, here's one of those items. So I pretty much took all of those inventories I had and put them together into one inventory that's centrally available for everyone in my department and further for everyone in the institution. So you take your items that you found in the office, weird things on shelves, hodgepodge around your desk, items that might be in multiple locations if you're set up that way, and you have assured yourself job security. So now you've done your inventory and you're on your way. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a minute. And before I build on this, we've got baseline standards. I've outlined the guidelines for efficient processing, and we've talked about how to do an inventory. So are there any burning questions that I should answer right now before moving on?
Hi, I don't think we have any burning questions at the moment.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So
wait, we do have one. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
So it's asking, how much time do you spend on appraisal?
Oh, well, that's a tricky question. Appraisal is not something we're necessarily going to get into with this webinar, but we do, as we are being contacted by someone, evaluate during that process. So during the donation process. If it's something that's already here, then we have to deal with it afterwards.
And there's also a question about privacy or security considerations, which I believe we'll address later in this webinar.
Yes.
Unless you have something to add now.
No.
And,
we'll get to that.
and the UC guidelines are available as a reference for non-UC institutions, and I'll be sure to send out that link to everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All great questions. All great questions. So moving forward, what is this checklist for? Well, you can make checklists for every aspect of your project management if you need to. But what I'm talking about specifically is for accessioning. And in this case, you'll want to look at your archival management system and pull the tasks from that in order to create your checklist. So for your checklist, you'll want to have some top-level info, like what's the accession number that you're going to give it, what's the title that you're going to give it. But then you want to follow the order of events as they appear in your management system. These are just a few examples here: Archivist Toolkit, Archive Space. You could be using an Access database. You could even be using a spreadsheet. But make sure your checklist just follows the order of events and all of the data entry points that you'll need in order to start your accessioning process. So let's look at some examples. So here's a simple checklist done in a Google document. You can see up here is some of that top level information that I was talking about, the accession number. And then this document follows Archivist Toolkit, and it follows the tabs in the order that you would see them. I think it goes linear left to right, and then you just check off the box after you've entered each data point. At UCI, we use a Word document. This has a broader sense of that overarching information. So here we have collection title. That's if it's going into an existing collection, or you could give it a preliminary title if it's going to be a new collection. Collection number, leave that blank if it's new, or add it if it's an addition to an existing. Accession number, very, very important. And then accession by and your start date, and then finally when you finish it, your end date. And again, this follows the archival management system, and it follows it in the order that you're going to be adding your data. We were with Archivist Toolkit, now we're with Archivespace. So here, after you enter your title, you just click it with an X, and so forth for your identifier, for your date accession, all the way down. And when you finish a certain section, we have an area here for you to put the date that you completed it. This checklist is going to help you because invariably you're going to get called away to do something else, and at least you can look at it and refer back to where you were in the process. Again, if you have a wiki and you want to put your checklist on that, this is another useful tool. And so in this case, I have taken that Word document and added it to our wiki. So if you're going to make an accession record and you need your checklist, you click on this button, it creates a new page, and now you're brought to that top level information. And so we would name this page with the file naming convention using the accession number. We would add the title, add the collection number if applicable, add the accession number, and then of course your name and when did you start this. So you click on Save, and now you have a new page on your wiki that is a checklist. And it has interactive boxes, so you just check them off as you enter each data point. So here you can see that Word document, all of those points have just been transferred over into a wiki document. One of the benefits of this, other than it being pretty cool, is that you can link the URL of your checklist in Archivespace so that you can bring it up all at the same time while you're working. Finally, it's integrated. So you've got the inventory and you've got your checklists all inventoried, and you can work from one page. And your boss can log in and see what you're doing. The reference librarian can log in and see what you're doing. The other manuscript processors can log in and see what you're doing. The only reason for this is integration, if it's as far as you want to go with scalability. You can bring it all the way back down. It doesn't have to be that complicated. We can still do inventory by going into stacks with a clipboard. We can still do checklists by keeping ourselves on task with paper and pencil. And we can always file things in the format that we used to do when we all started being archivists, right? So it doesn't have to be that complicated. Remember to keep your project management scalable. Scalable up if you need to do it, or scalable back down if you have more simple things to work with. All right, workflow and project plan. So workflow I consider as a large-scale view of the project plan. And when you made your checklist, you had all those little tasks that need to be done. So this is great because if you have professional staff or volunteers or student assistants, you can now think about how you're going to delegate these tasks and divide the work. So let's look here. You've got your inventory, you've got your checklist, you've got your workflow. So you know what you have, you know the detailed tasks, you know who to delegate your tasks to, and you know when they are not going to be overwhelmed and be able to take on your tasks. So here's an example workflow that we have here at UCI, and I'll drill in so that you can see in better detail. So I want to focus on the second two tiers here, rehousing and shelving. So you can see that there's going to be some consultation, and then we're going to do student work tickets for rehousing and storage. This is really going to save you a lot of time and money if you can do that. But you need to put it into your workflow so everybody knows who does what and when. And then you can also see who's going to be creating these accession records. Now you use your checklist when you're creating the accession record, but at least here you can see who these tasks are delegated to. If you don't have volunteers and extra staff, your workflow is a lot more easy. So let's talk about a project plan. Now we're drilling down a little bit from the workflow. A project plan is different from a processing plan in that it's the establishment of your scope and defining your objectives and what steps you're going to take to obtain them. This is different, like I said, than a processing plan because it's looking at the approach and how you're going to manage all of the project according to all of these parameters that you've just set forth. And it also provides a place for you to put in deadlines so you can keep yourself going. So here's an example of a project plan. This is for the University Archives accessioning. It says queue and tracker, but it really is a project plan if you think about it, because it's outlining here what needs to be accessioned, what is being accessioned, what has been accessioned for University Archives. This is your overarching project. You want to get these things accessioned. And further, you have some of the broad tasks outlined, so you can keep yourself on track with status. Is it queued, or is it in progress? If it's in progress, what broad category of tasks does it need done? Does it need to be cataloged, or does it need imaging? Or maybe it needs its finding aid posted online. Or maybe it needs some kind of content uploaded into our preservation server. You can see here, it has a place for delegating the task to which archivist. And it also has the place for you to put in for date started and what the priority is. And this will really go a long way in keeping you on track and keeping you moving in terms of your scope and your deadlines. And a solid plan can also be created either after or even organically along with your inventory, because you want to consider all of the factors that make plans change. And if you have a solid construct for why your plan is built a certain way, you'll totally be able to roll with the changes, and you can quickly communicate your status to interested parties. So here's another example on the manuscript side. Same thing. We're dealing with accessioning. And here we know that we want to accession the new collections. We want to create those minimum compliant collection level records. We do want to get them onto the Online Archive of California, and we want to make sure they're stored. And again, within the project plan, you've got your status. You know where you are in the progress, or if it's in the queue, or if it's completed. And finally, the status is down here. So what you're looking at here is a scroll down on that page. Again, who are these things assigned to? You've got your checklist. Drill down in more detail to keep you on track. And now we're going to drill down, that was kind of a quick transition, into questions. So at this point, I have seen some questions come up in the chat, but I'll open it up to Marie and let her delegate.
Hi, Kelly. There's some great questions. I think I misunderstood one of the earlier questions. I think the question is, do you have a concern about sharing your checklist within your institution? Does that raise any privacy concerns for you?
The checklist?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah. Okay, and the second question is the checklist in addition to an ACE-based accession record? And I think you addressed that.
Yes. So the checklist is keeping you on task with your archive space accession record. I can see the argument for not necessarily needing it, but I think it's super helpful if you have it.
Great. And there was also a question, and I'm not sure if we should address this here, about accessioning smaller items that wouldn't warrant a collection level record in OAC, and how you handle that.
That's an excellent question. Smaller items get a resource record if they are a new collection.
Okay, that sounds great, Kelly. There also is a question about preservation activities and if they're included in rehousing, but I think we'll address that in the next session.
Yes. They will be included in rehousing, and Laura will get to that in her part of the presentation. Okay.
We have actually just a few more questions, if that's okay. One coming through, do you figure out DAX date kind of formatting at the time that you're doing the accessioning?
Oh, I think Kelly is muted now. Hang on.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so do we figure out DAX date at the time of accessioning? We give it a broad date as we are able to understand it from looking through the material during accessioning. During the rehousing process, a lot of that becomes more clear what the exact date range is.
And just a background question in terms of how that wiki was created, the wiki space, if you could share information in terms of what it took to get that going.
Oh, you mean the actual page or the wiki domain?
I guess your wiki pages and the domain.
Okay, so the domain comes from the university. That's great. We all get an account and we can create our own pages. The page, well, let's put it this way. I've been here for 2.5 years, and I probably started it my first year, so it took a while to ramp it up to what it is now. But that's where we get back into scalability. You can start small and you can build on it, and if it gets cumbersome, you can drill back down. And I'm perfectly happy. My email address will be available after this. If anyone has questions on how to construct those kinds of things, they can just send questions directly to me.
Great. Thank you, Kelly.
Okay. This is Laura. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, Laura, we can hear you, and it looks like your slides are loading.
Let's see.
There we go. So we can see the accessioning slide now.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I'm Laura Uglean Jackson, and I'm going to delve in a little bit more with accessioning and processing. And while I'm presenting, I'm going to speak as if I still worked at UC Irvine. So I'm going to be saying we and our, and I'm referring to myself and UCI, even though I am no longer at UCI. Now I'm at the University of Northern Colorado. And I will warn you, my slides are not as fun as Kelly's, so I do apologize for not having those hilarious GIFs and or GIFs or whatever they're called. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about accessioning. And I'm going to talk about accessioning because accessioning really is the foundation for efficient processing and ultimately for access. So just so that we're all on the same page, I created a definition of accessioning. Accessioning is gaining physical and intellectual control of material, usually around the time that it was acquired, although it doesn't have to be. Accessioning includes documenting administrative and descriptive information about the material, ideally in a collections management database, although also you don't have to do this in a collections management database. It's essentially the start of describing a collection or an accrual to a collection and to managing this material. Oh, there it goes. So accessioning is the foundation for efficient processing because the accession records that you're creating can easily transform into these minimum DAX compliance finding aids that Kelly mentioned earlier. And so just to reiterate that DAX is the descriptive standard for describing archival collections. Creating finding aids based on the minimum requirements in DAX can be instrumental to having collection level access points for all of your collections. And this is really the core concept of the UC guidelines for efficient processing. Creating collection level records for all your holdings is the first concept mentioned in these guidelines, and they state that this should be a repository's first priority. So making accessioning part of your collections management workflow helps to create a streamlined process for these collection level records. And whether you're describing material that just came in the door or material that has been sitting on the shelf for decades, having a consistent written procedure for accessioning is very useful. And at UC Irvine, we have a written process for various situations. So we have written procedures for when we have a brand new collection come in the door. We have a step-by-step process for how we accession that material. And then we also have a variant on the accessioning process for additions to processed collections and additions to unprocessed collections. So we have this fairly lengthy accessioning manual that spells out accessioning procedures in detail. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I do want to give you the gist of our accessioning processes, which hopefully you can take some of this information and adapt it for your institution. Now, when accessioning, much of the work involves recording and documenting information about the material and the acquisition. So, as Kelly mentioned, my slides, sorry. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so at UCI, we use ASpace to create accession records. ASpace, it's also called ArchivesSpace. This is a collections management database, and you're seeing an image of an accession record in ASpace. That's what you're seeing on the screen. But you could do this work in another collections management database. You could do this work in a spreadsheet. You could even do this work on paper if that is what is available to you and working for you. The important thing for creating these accession records is recording the information in a way that is going to be saved for a long time and that is consistent across your institution. That's good enough. As long as everybody is doing the same thing, following the same process, recording it in the same place, that is totally fine. And sorry for taking a minute for these slides to switch out. My laptop decided to give me some problems, but I'll just continue and the slides will catch up. So in ASpace, we enter basic descriptive information and really emphasis on the word basic. We put in the title, we put in dates, an extent, the creator, the scope and content, and any restrictions. And we also, at this point, we do a super quick box level inventory so that we have some idea of what is in each box. And then we also include what I would call administrative information because this information doesn't become public. So we're writing down who donated it, when, and how. And really, I think it's interesting to see what we're not recording. So we're not doing subject headings. We're not doing a biographical note. The description is really minimal. Oh, and there it is. Okay, and then, okay, great. The last thing that we do is we assign a value score to each accession. Assigning a value score, when you do this, it's necessary to have some kind of knowledge about the material. So doing this at the end of your accessioning process it makes sense to do that. And a value score is a number that is calculated by determining the value of 4 categories that are weighted 1 to 5. The categories that you see on the screen, these are in the UC guidelines, and the first one is user interest. So how likely is the collection to be used by researchers? And then the second is research value. This is where we're looking at the content. Is the content historically significant? How valuable is it? The third category is institutional value. Here we are trying to assess how valuable is this collection for the institution at large. Perhaps it's from a VIP donor or an important unit within your organization. And then fourth is the object value. So here we're assessing, are any of the items within this accession, are they monetarily valuable? Are they at risk for theft? And do any of them have any high exhibit value? So you add up the numbers from these 4 categories to get your value score. And again, you know, these categories, this is what the UCs use, it's what works for the UCs, but you can certainly amend this to have it make sense for your institution. Okay. And the resulting numbers can then assist in prioritizing collections for processing. So you can quickly see what has a high value score and process those collections first. In addition to helping you prioritize what should be processed, each number, each score aligns with the level of processing that a collection should be processed to, thus allowing for this golden minimum of each collection. And the golden minimum is when you perform the minimum amount of work necessary to make a collection usable. And that is the core concept within the UC guidelines. Because not all collections need to be processed to the file or folder level. And actually, I would go so far as to say not all collections need to be processed. So when you are planning for processing, determining, you know, what you're going to do, don't expect a one-size-fits-all for your collections. So I want to just shift gears a little bit and talk about actually accessioning quickly. Accessioning shouldn't take you long, but there are a few things that you can keep in mind to make this process go faster. So first, you know, when you're gathering information to record and you're entering it into your whatever system you're using, this really shouldn't take you much time, because at this stage, the description is not going to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. During the accessioning stage, you're really just getting the information that's going to help users determine if they need to see the collection. And you're noting the important administrative information for your own record-keeping purposes and collections management. So detailed information like specific and really accurate dates, subject headings, an accurate content listing, all of that can be done later when you process the collection. The task that tends to take the most time during accessioning is rehousing, putting the material in archival boxes and ensuring that should a researcher request to use the collection, that it can be used in the reading room. To this end, the material should be rehoused only to the point that the user can go through the material according to your reading room policies. So for example, at UC Irvine, our policy is that a user can only have 1 box of material at a time and can only use 1 folder out of that box at a time and needs to keep all of the material in order. So all of even our unprocessed materials have to be in folders within boxes that are, you know, these folders need to be easy to remove and return and keep in order. And getting everything into folders and into boxes can be extremely time consuming when it doesn't come in that lovely organized fashion, as Kelly showed us earlier. So what do? Well, when we get boxes of loose papers, you know, loose photographs, no folders, no containers, no organization, we simply place them in an archival folder. We keep any order that there might be, and we don't title anything. But then it's in a folder and it's in a box, it's good to go. Things that come in binders and hanging folders, we actually do take the time to folder that material, but only because we have students that can do that work for us. But if you don't have any help to to rehouse these things that are kind of already in their own nice little containers, you don't really have to do it, right? We're not going for perfect here. And speaking of extra help, so at UCI, we do have students to complete, these kind of more rote tasks so that the archivists can focus on higher level things like higher level descriptive work and management. And one way that we do this is through what we call the work ticket system. So at UCI, we have this fabulous system that we use to submit projects and track the progress on. So every time I need a student to rehouse binders, I just copy and paste the same instructions into this work ticket system. It gets assigned to a student. They tell me where they are at the end of the day through the system, how far they've gotten, and when they're finished. And it saves a lot of time. And on the screen, you can see an example of a work ticket. UCI, that's the only place I've worked at that has the system in place. We don't have that here at my new institution. And so I really don't think this is very common. And so just to give you all a piece of wisdom that my former boss gave to me in order to ask for more help or for systems like this work ticket system, determine how much it would cost your organization to pay you to do the work that students, interns, pretty much anyone making less than you can do, and then do the math, figure out the savings, and take the savings to your boss or who's ever in charge, whoever makes these decisions, to hopefully get some help with these very time-consuming tasks that can be accomplished by non-professional staff. All right. So at this point in our accessioning process, we would use that descriptive information in the accession record to create the finding aid, which we would then publish online. Here's an example of a collection level minimum finding aid that is in the Online Archive of California. And in addition to the finding aid, we create a collection level marked record, so a catalog record in our library's online catalog, and you can see an example of that on the screen. The online finding aid and the marked record make the collection discoverable. So now users can request it, which means that we are providing access to unprocessed materials. However, there's a caveat to that. We put an access restriction on most of our unprocessed content, and the exception is when we know 100% that the material, the unprocessed collection, can be open for research. These are usually things like collections that are entirely made up of photographs. So most of our finding aids for unprocessed collections have this statement: the collection has not been processed. It may contain restricted materials. Please contact the Department of Special Collections and Archives in advance to request access. And we do get requests for these unprocessed collections. And so when we receive those, first we try to narrow down the request to as few boxes as possible using that quick inventory that we created during accessioning. Then we let the researcher know how long it's going to take. Depending on how many boxes that the researcher wants to use, this can take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks to review all of the materials. This might seem like a long time to some of you. It seems like a long time to me. But having this system in place allows us to quickly create collection level records without worrying if we're accidentally providing access to something that we shouldn't. So an archivist will go through the material to check for restricted information like social security numbers and credit card numbers. If and when we find this material, we'll determine what to do with it. And usually we will opt to weed it out and destroy it rather than separate it and manage it as restricted material. We do this because usually material that has restricted information on it, we'll appraise it, but usually we found it doesn't hold much, if any, historical value, and it just does not justify the time and resources that it takes to keep and manage this material that's not accessible to anybody, and usually we're having to keep and manage it for a long period of time. So then the researcher can see the collection, and we can update the finding aid. We can say this collection is now open, or these certain boxes are open for access. We also keep a list of unprocessed collections that are requested, and then this list can be used to determine processing priorities, ideally in tandem with the value score. Okay, so before I go into processing, I want to stop and ask if there's any burning questions. It looks like there were some.
Hi, Laura. We have 2 questions about rehousing.
Okay.
The first is, are any preservation activities performed during rehousing? How do you handle preservation at this stage?
Right. So most of the material we're dealing with is, modern day records, things that have been created, after, I don't know, 1950, 1960. So we usually don't see a lot of serious preservation concerns. And at this point, I would say that if we did come across something that, maybe it was a really important item that, needed some work before it could even be, touched, we would try to stabilize it as best we could. I mean, at UC Irvine, we don't have a conservator or conservation or preservation department. So our resources would be very limited to really do much with it beyond, maybe putting it in Mylar and making sure it is housed as best that we can house it. And then, I would imagine that we would want to document that, there's this item that is going to crumble or whatever as soon as you open the box. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Laura. And we're a bit pressed for time, so I think we should save the rest of the questions for the end, and I'll keep note of all of them.
Okay, that sounds great. And I will try to speed it up. All right, so let's talk about processing. Processing these collections that have come in more fully. At this point in the archival lifecycle, everything has a collection level record. You would have your value scores, and you would know what has been requested in the reading room. So now you're ready to process some collections. But this is only true for collections that you've assigned a value score to. Likely, you will have many collections that don't have value scores since they came in and were accessioned prior to you having this awesome system in place. This was certainly true for the university archives when I was trying to determine the processing priorities for university archives at UCI. And so I did have to do a retroactive value score project so that I could figure out what I should process first. So for this project, I didn't do a value score for every accession and every collection that didn't have a value score. Instead, I assigned value scores only to collections that met certain criteria. My criteria were all unprocessed collections over 5 linear feet that had a lot of visual materials in them, or if they documented or represented diversity on campus, or if it came from a top-level university unit. And those were the ones I assigned value scores to. Now, one of the core concepts from the UC guidelines when thinking about processing is to plan to under-process, because a collection can always be processed in more detail later, but you can't get the time and resources back from over-processing. When you are starting to process these collections, creating a processing plan is advisable. A processing plan is going to keep you on track. It's going to help you get a bird's eye view of all the work that needs to be accomplished. And it can really facilitate communication between you and anyone who might be working on the collection. It's especially useful if you're having a paraprofessional do most of the processing, or even if they are creating this processing plan, then you can see what they're planning to do. So I really like the UCI processing plan template. Before I worked at UCI, I didn't make this type of processing plan because I felt like it took too long. And I found that a lot of processing plan templates are really just templates for the finding aid, where you're actually writing out a biographical historical note and a scope and content. And I thought, why am I duplicating the work there? So this template is easy to complete, and it's useful. It's not repetitive of most things in the finding aid. So I'm just going to walk you through it really quickly. First, there's a section on basic information. All of this information should be readily available to you through accession records and collection files. The second section is a place to plop in that value score. So here, if you didn't have a value score, you could create one. And then the third section is a place to put the estimated processing hours. There is a lovely table in the UC guidelines for processing rates. And this table shows how many hours it's going to take to process 1 linear foot. And it's based on 2 things. First, the value score. And second, the condition of the collection. Generally, how much rehousing is going to be needed to make this collection really usable and for you to consider it processed. And so here's where you could factor in any issues, such as if you didn't take anything out of the binders during accessioning, or if all the photos need to be individually sleeved, or if you have a serious preservation issue. And you can really see this chart shows you just how much more time it's going to take you to process at the file level and at the item level. Okay, so then there is a space to lay out the organization of the collection and note anything about the original order. That's at the top here. And then there is this lovely table to plan out your series for the collection. Just like how not all collections are created equal, not all series are created equal. You don't need to process all of the series to the same level. And so this gives you an option to figure out, where you're going, the level that you're going to process the series to. Now, you could do a value score for each series, but that's going to take you a lot of time. And so I just wing it when I consider, how deep to process the different series. And then that collection level value score that you created, that can act as the maximum level that a series can and should be processed to. So this table here, you can note the arrangement and description of the series, any rehousing and weeding that needs to happen. And this is super helpful, especially when you're working on large collections, because you will likely forget what you decided to do at the beginning. And here it's all written down. And then finally, you can note any support work that you might need, any supplies, and also there's a section to note any restrictions that the collection has. Okay. And so finally, I just want to give you a few tips and tricks that I do when I process for processing quickly. And I apologize if some of these are obvious. I'm sure that the more seasoned processors on the line you have your own tips and tricks that we'd all benefit from hearing about, possibly in the Q&A or the chat. So first, work on one series at a time. Whenever I start processing a collection, I always choose to work on the easiest series first, because it makes me feel like I'm working through the collection at a good rate. And it also means that I'm keeping any of the difficult or complex items or series, the more difficult materials that you might not know what to do with, those I save for the end. And then by the time I get to them, as I'm working through the whole collection, it kind of becomes clear where they might go or what I might do with all the weird stuff. And then second, use concepts from MPLP. MPLP stands for More Product, Less Process. This was an article that was published about 10 years ago. And this article essentially sparked this movement within the profession to provide access to more collections faster. In the article, the authors point out that processing is not a craft. It doesn't have to look pretty. It just needs to be stabilized and usable by researchers. So to this end, reuse original folders. Keep those original titles that were written by, who knows who, when it's applicable to do so. The less description work that you have to do at the folder and item level, the more efficient it's going to be. Third, keep added value and optimum collection level notes concise, even very brief. The added value and optimum notes, those refer to the DAX descriptive standard, and so DAX has these required metadata fields that Kelly pointed out earlier, and it also has added value and optimum fields for description. The added value and optimum fields, those are extra pieces of information that are nice, they can be useful, but they are not absolutely necessary for discovering a collection. So things like the biographical historical notes, that you don't need to write a small book about a person or an organization. Things like the arrangement note, that sometimes can take a long time to create, and sometimes the collection just doesn't need it because everything is arranged alphabetically and it's obvious how it's arranged. And then lastly, try to avoid physically arranging everything in the collection when possible. Many times you do need to rearrange the material, especially when you're trying to figure out the series and trying to get a handle on everything. But if you can intellectually arrange the different series, do it. Use spreadsheets and tables and then sort the titles alphabetically. It's going to save you a lot of time. So hopefully this provides you with an overview on creating collection level records and prioritizing collections for fuller processing. I think that this is an ideal process for dealing with and avoiding backlogs. That said, it doesn't always happen like this, and so Kelly and I just want to quickly share 2 experiences that reflect processing in the real world. And I'm going to throw it back to Kelly.
Thanks, Lara. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left. So, processing in the Wild West. I'll give you an example from the Sleeper collection. Lara can talk real quick about publications in university archives. So, the Jim Sleeper papers was a 120 linear feet collection that I inherited when I started. We had multiple contributors. So we had the donor's widow helping with the arrangement in terms of information and consultation. We had a historian helping with description. We had students helping with a container list. And here's what happened. I had each student had a set of boxes to create a container list for, and they did it in a spreadsheet. Then I put all the spreadsheets together. Then I did some computer magic on the back end and got it all massaged into an EAD format and put it in the archive space. But what happens is there's some inconsistencies in formatting. So you can see here with this entry for a folder, you've got a lowercase c. For this entry, it's an uppercase. Is that a big deal? Well, it could be in terms of sorting or other things, but does it still work? And can we get it into the hands of users? Absolutely. And can I put the finding aid container list cleanup on a someday maybe list for a project? Sure, we can deal with it that way. So that's one small example of what can happen. And I'll give it back to Lara to talk to you about publications.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kelly. And, oh, sorry. I should have been following along. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick example of how I did not do anything that I just said. And okay, here we go. So I have a confession. I did not accession the publications series material that I worked on. Actually, I didn't create collection level finding aids first either. So just a little bit of background about this project that I'm calling the Publications Series Project. I had a backlog of university publications and ephemera. This stuff had been sitting on the shelves for a decade or so, and whenever a unit in the university would send a brochure or an announcement, it would go into this it would go into these boxes called the Future Publication Series boxes. By the time I started working on this material, which had no access at all, by the way, it had grown to about 24 linear feet or 24 cubic feet of space. So to tackle this material, to make it accessible, I first created a plan, and the plan included sending the monographs and serials to our cataloging unit, so they could just be cataloged at the item level. And then I still had all of these brochures and flyers and stuff like that. And that doesn't easily lend itself to item level cataloging. So that material was going into what we had called the publication series collections. These were collections, archival collections, that had been created and essentially to hold these one-off things that units would send us, their publications and other distributed materials. And they were created so that when a unit sent us one thing, we could just drop it in a folder, update the finding aid, and be done with it. So when I started to process this material, I looked to see if accession records had been created for previous publication series material. And of course, I found that sometimes they did it and sometimes they didn't. It was really inconsistent. So I made the decision to not create accession records for this material because it would take too much time. The material would be accessible without the accession record because I also was processing this material. This material is going to be available through a finding aid. And here's an example of one of these publication series on the screen. So there you have it. As much as I love consistent procedures and documentation, sometimes just going straight to processing, it just makes the most sense. So that is our reality checks, and now I think we can open it up to questions.
Great, thanks to you both. This is Marie. We have some really interesting questions. I'm going to begin. One of our participants asks about providing access to unprocessed collections and how this affects citations, because the curators at their workplace are concerned that providing access to an unprocessed collection could make the citations wrong post-processing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a concern. I guess it depends on how often are these unprocessed collections being cited, in a professional manner, and taking that into consideration. If a lot of your researchers are scholars that are using these collections and publishing about them and citing them for all to see, then you would want to have some kind of a workaround. I don't know what that is. Perhaps Kelly has an idea. But for us, a lot of our researchers are students, and they might be citing it in their undergraduate papers or whatnot, but it hasn't been a problem for us.
Yeah, I agree with you, Laura. And I think also in working with a curator or a person who wants to cite something and it's unprocessed, if you have the ability to discuss this with them, you can come up with a way to cite it and give it more of a general citation that it's within the collection, and still it gets the attribution, but you don't have to worry about if things change. And in terms of things being removed from collections, that usually doesn't happen. So whatever the person is citing is still there. It just might take a little extra research after processing to find it. But then again, after processing, it should be described in more detail. So it should be easier to find the thing that they've cited.
Great. There was another question I hope I'm interpreting this correctly, but how do you balance processing on demand with also setting priorities based on the value score as you discussed, Laura?
That's a good question. Sometimes things need to be processed and throw all the priorities and value scores out the window. That's the reality, right? And so how do you balance that? Well, I'm not sure, because I would say that as long as you're not, as long as your processing priorities are not constantly being, well, let me think about this. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, just from my perspective, since at UCI I'm the one who evaluates all the unprocessed collections before they go out to be used for research, you've got two things going on. One is collections are just being evaluated for restricted information before being made available. So we're not actually processing at that point. We're just making sure that we are not giving researchers anything that's restricted or that we shouldn't be giving them, for reasons of privacy and confidentiality. In terms of processing on demand, that I have seen in other institutions more than I've seen here, in particular in a program that I implemented at my former institution. And it seems to work in conjunction with the value score. So we are assigning the value score, but that's our judgment, right? And you get someone who is interested in something, and that kind of changes your perception on what is the interest level of the researcher community. And so it can work in conjunction. You just have to really balance out your priorities. And that's where coming back to your project planning and keeping track of where you are and what projects you are going at all times can really help you out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also just say that if processing on demand makes more sense to your institution than creating these value scores, then that's what makes sense and that's what works for your repository.
Another viewer would like you guys to talk a bit more about Born Digital collections and records and how the UC guidelines address or don't address these.
Okay, SCA education community, another webinar.
Yeah, that is a whole nother webinar. The UC guidelines, they don't have there is not a lot about Born Digital in there. I know that there is a group that is working on how to describe Born Digital in a finding aid. And so that's a UC group, a group of digital archivists that are working on that. And I'm not sure quite where they are in the process, but I know that what they come up with is going to be really valuable. How do you describe the extent of Born Digital? How do you, what extent do you record everything, all the processing activities that have gone into processing Born Digital, things like that. And they're going to come up with some guidelines. Mm-hmm.
Great. We have another great question. I really like this one. Have you guys received any pushback from your public services staff or curators or reference staff about efficiently processed collections?
I haven't. They're just happy that it's out there and the researchers can use it. I think the only sticky point would be that they have to be communicating with a researcher and letting them know, well, if you have this much material that you want to review, it's going to take our archivist 2 weeks to do it. Or if you have this much amount, it might be 2 months. So managing expectations with the researchers, I think, is where our public-facing people are on the front lines. But they do an excellent job of it. And, we all collaborate and we're all very teamwork-oriented. So we're keeping the users' interests at heart and doing what we do to help them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that having all of these collections described online is, you know, it creates more, you get more researchers in. And on one hand, that is great. On the other hand, the public services staff is going to be much busier. And so there, you know, there is that consequence from doing this. But ultimately, that's why we exist, right? Is to provide access. So it's mainly been positive.
Great. And here's another question. How do you make intellectually arranged materials and off-site storage available? And she writes, I haven't been able to discontinue physical arrangement due to limitations on how many boxes can travel at once and on semi-accurate legacy guides, which I think is a very interesting question and problem.
Oh, man. Yeah, intellectually arranging collections lends itself to having everything in front of you and not going box by box to describe it. That's something else I'll have to think about. Kelly, do you have any pearls of wisdom?
I had one experience in my at my former job where I actually trained someone out at the off-site storage facility who was in library school. Now this is like a magic unicorn, right, that works out there. Went out to the off-site facility and trained her on how to help me with some of that so that we could kind of do this remote processing. I will say it was not the best solution, but it was a workaround. And if I think about it a little bit longer, and kind of if the person who submitted the question wants to get in contact with me, we can talk about it and try to brainstorm some ways to deal with that.
Great, and the next question sort of dovetails nicely into the last one. If you could speak a little more on focusing on intellectual arrangement versus physical arrangement.
Sure.
Do you want to
sorry. Well, I'm not quite sure what exactly they want to know about intellectual arrangement.
Do you have an example of when you would do that versus physically rearranging things?
I can jump in here and we can go back to that sleeper example that I showed at the end with the inconsistencies in formatting. We had an example where a researcher just last week was using that collection, which was great. But some of the items that they wanted might have been listed as box 95, folder 11, box 96, folder whatever. And so intellectually arranged on the finding aid, they made sense. But then when you go to order the boxes, they don't always make sense. We also found that there were a few repeated entries where it looked like there were folders and boxes where there weren't. So that I was able to quickly clean up because that's not acceptable. But it does get to be a challenge when you have the material in a large collection like that, not nested next to its related material. But the good thing for us is that collection is on site. It is easy to retrieve the boxes, and the person looking at the finding aid is at least able to make sense of it intellectually in the way that they wanted it.
Yeah, and just to follow up and just provide a couple of examples, I have intellectually arranged many a collection. Some collections that have, it's all in folders. The folders have titles. Just going through and determining, okay, this folder goes into series 1 and the second folder goes into series 3. It's, it's correspondence, and maybe series 1 is financial records. And so rather than taking everything out of the boxes and making piles and putting it all back together and you know, physically arranged series. I've just been able to do that descriptive work through a spreadsheet, and then, you know, put the folder number, the box and folder number with it, so that it's intellectually arranged, even, but you can still find everything.
Okay, we have a final question. I know we've reached our time, but if you provide access to unprocessed collections, how do you prepare and educate your patrons?
We have a written set of guidelines, and everyone who is trained on the reference desk is trained to also know how to deliver unprocessed materials to the patron. So it's on site, and we work with them, and when we bring out a box, you know, this is unprocessed, here's how you work with it, and if you have any questions, we're standing right here to help you, or sitting right here to help you.
All right, well, it looks like we're at time. So thanks again to Kelly and Laura for presenting on today's webinar, and to all of you for registering and for joining us today. So we'll be circulating a link to the webinar and slides after today. And if you have a minute to spare, we'd really welcome your feedback. There's a real quick survey we've posted here. I've put that in the chat as well. If you have suggestions for upcoming webinars, please weigh in, and thank you again.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you.